In the summer of 1943, deep in the heart of Nazi-occupied territory, a moment occurred that would shake the very foundations of military protocol and human dignity. What started as a simple command from a decorated general would spiral into an event so extraordinary, so unexpected, that would be whispered about in military circles for decades to come. Picture this: a seasoned commander with 30 years of service, standing before his troops with an order that seemed routine on the surface. But what happened next defied every expectation, broke every rule, and revealed the true power of human conscience over blind obedience. This isn't just another war story. This is the account of General Heinrich Weber, a man caught between duty and humanity, whose single salute order would expose a truth so powerful it could have changed the course of history itself. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about military discipline, moral courage, and the incredible strength of the human spirit when faced with impossible choices. The result? Something so unbelievable that military historians still debate whether it actually happened. But the evidence is there, hidden in classified documents and witness testimonies that have only recently come to light. Are you ready to discover what happened when one general's order met the unstoppable force of human decency? The answer will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, authority, and the courage to do what's right when the whole world is watching. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the Bavarian military compound as General Heinrich Weber stood at his office window, watching his soldiers prepare for what would become the most controversial day of his distinguished career. At 54 years old, Weber had served his country through 2 world wars, earning respect from both his superiors and subordinates for his tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to duty. His chest bore the weight of numerous medals, each telling a story of courage under fire and leadership in the darkest moments of conflict. But this morning was different. The telegram that had arrived at dawn carried orders that made his stomach churn with unease. The message, bearing the official seal of high command, instructed him to implement a new protocol that would test the limits of military obedience and challenge everything he had believed about honor and service. Weber had grown up in a military family where duty was not just a concept, but a way of life. His father had been a colonel in the Imperial German Army, and his grandfather had served under Prussian command. The Weber family name was synonymous with military excellence, and Heinrich had spent his entire adult life living up to that legacy. He had never questioned an order, never hesitated to carry out his duties, no matter how difficult or dangerous they might be. The general's aide, Captain Franz Müller, knocked softly on the door before entering with the morning briefings. Müller had served under Weber for 3 years and had developed a deep respect for his commander's integrity and tactical mind. He noticed immediately that something was troubling the general, whose usually composed demeanor showed signs of internal struggle. Weber turned from the window, his weathered face bearing the lines of a man who had seen too much of war's brutality. His steel-gray eyes, which had witnessed countless battles and made decisions that affected thousands of lives, now reflected a conflict that went beyond military strategy. The order he held in his hands represented more than just another directive from headquarters. It was a test of his very soul. The compound itself was a fortress of tradition and discipline. Built in the early 1800s, its thick stone walls had housed generations of German military officers. The parade grounds had witnessed countless ceremonies, promotions, and demonstrations of military precision. Every brick and beam seemed to echo with the weight of history and the expectations of those who had served before. Weber's own office reflected his character and career. Maps covered one wall, marked with the routes of past campaigns and strategic positions he had held during his rise through the ranks. His desk, made from dark oak, had belonged to his father and bore the scars of decades of military planning. Photographs of his regiment and fellow officers lined another wall, their faces frozen in moments of triumph and camaraderie. As he reviewed the morning schedule, Weber knew that the day ahead would require him to address his troops with new instructions that would fundamentally change their duties. The order specified that all soldiers under his command must participate in a salute ceremony that would demonstrate their loyalty to the current regime. On the surface, it seemed like a routine military exercise, but Weber understood the deeper implications. The political climate had shifted dramatically in recent months, and military commanders were being pressured to enforce new policies that many found morally questionable. Weber had watched as colleagues were reassigned or dismissed for failing to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for these changes. The pressure to conform was intense, and the consequences of resistance were severe. Captain Mueller spread the morning reports across the general's desk, noting the tension in his commander's posture. The reports contained routine information about troop readiness, supply levels, and training schedules, but today they seemed to weigh heavily on Weber's mind. Each page represented soldiers under his command, young men who looked to him for leadership and guidance. Weber had always prided himself on being a soldier's general, someone who understood the concerns and challenges faced by the men under his command. He had shared their hardships, celebrated their victories, and mourned their losses. The bond between a commander and his troops was sacred to him, built on mutual respect and trust that had been earned through years of shared service. The general picked up a photograph from his desk, showing his regiment after a successful defensive action the previous year. The faces of his soldiers looked back at him, their eyes bright with the pride of victory and the confidence that came from serving under effective leadership. Many of these same men would be assembled in the courtyard within hours, waiting for his orders and trusting that he would guide them with the same wisdom and integrity they had come to expect. Weber's thoughts turned to his family, particularly his son Klaus, who was serving as a lieutenant in another division. The young man had followed in the family tradition of military service, and Weber had been proud to see him develop into a capable officer. But now he wondered what kind of army his son was inheriting and what compromises future generations would be forced to make. The general's meditation was interrupted by the sound of boots marching in formation outside his window. He watched as company after company of his soldiers moved across the parade grounds, their synchronized steps echoing off the surrounding buildings. These were professional soldiers, trained to follow orders without question and to trust in the judgment of their commanders. Their discipline and dedication were exemplary, but Weber realized that these very qualities might soon be used in ways that contradicted the honor and integrity that had originally motivated their service. As the morning progressed, Weber met with his senior staff to discuss the implementation of the new orders. The conference room, lined with portraits of distinguished military leaders from German history, provided a sobering backdrop for their deliberations. Colonel Ernst Hoffmann, Weber's chief of staff, had served alongside the general for over a decade and shared many of his concerns about the changing nature of their duties. The discussion was tense, with several officers expressing reservations about the new protocols. Major Wilhelm Schultz, a decorated veteran who commanded the base's largest battalion, voiced what many were thinking when he questioned whether the orders were consistent with their oath as soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Richter, responsible for training and discipline, worried about the effect these new requirements would have on morale and unit cohesion. Weber listened to each of his officers, recognizing that their concerns mirrored his own. These were experienced military professionals who had dedicated their lives to service and understood the importance of maintaining the highest standards of conduct. The fact that they were questioning these orders spoke to the fundamental conflict between their professional duties and their personal convictions. The general realized that whatever decision he made would have far-reaching consequences. If he implemented the orders without question, he would be asking his soldiers to participate in actions that many would find morally objectionable. If he refused or modified the orders, he would risk court-martial and the destruction of his career, but more importantly, he might be replaced by someone with fewer scruples about enforcing harsh policies. As the meeting concluded, Weber dismissed his staff with instructions to prepare for the afternoon ceremony. Each officer left with a heavy heart, understanding that they were about to participate in something that would test the very foundations of their military service. The general remained alone in the conference room, staring at the portraits of past commanders and wondering what they would have done in his situation. The weight of command had never felt heavier as Weber contemplated the choice before him. He could follow orders and maintain his position, preserving his ability to protect his soldiers in future situations. Or he could take a stand based on principle, knowing that such action might ultimately result in worse leadership for the men under his command. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Weber finally made his decision. Whatever happened next would define not only his own legacy, but also the character of every soldier who served under him. The salute order that had seemed so simple on paper was about to become a defining moment that would test the limits of loyalty, duty, and human conscience. The parade ground fell silent as General Weber stepped onto the elevated platform that had been erected for the ceremony. Nearly 800 soldiers stood in perfect formation before him, their uniforms pressed, their boots polished to mirror brightness, their faces reflecting the discipline and professionalism that had made them respected throughout the military hierarchy. The late afternoon sun cast dramatic shadows across the courtyard, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for what was about to unfold. Weber had spent the last 2 hours in his private quarters, wrestling with his conscience and preparing remarks that would somehow bridge the gap between his orders and his convictions. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the official directive, knowing that every word he spoke would be scrutinized by both his superiors and his subordinates. The weight of 800 pairs of eyes focused on him with an intensity that made this moment feel more significant than any battle he had ever commanded. Captain Mueller stood at attention beside the platform, his role as aide requiring him to assist with the ceremony while privately sharing his commander's reservations about its purpose. The captain had served in combat alongside many of these soldiers and knew them as individuals with families, dreams, and personal codes of honor that extended beyond their military duties. He watched Weber's face carefully, searching for any hint of what approach the general would take. The assembled troops represented the finest traditions of German military excellence. Among them stood Sergeant Major Otto Brennan, a 20-year veteran who had earned his rank through exceptional service and unwavering dedication to his men. Brennan had fought alongside Weber in previous campaigns and had developed an almost paternal relationship with the younger soldiers under his command. His weathered face bore the scars of combat, but his eyes reflected a wisdom that came from understanding the true cost of warfare. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, fresh from the military academy and assigned to his first command position, stood nervously at the head of his platoon. The young officer had grown up hearing stories of Weber's tactical brilliance and moral leadership, and joining the general's command had been the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. Now, as he watched his commanding officer prepare to address the assembled troops, he sensed that something extraordinary was about to occur. Weber stepped forward and surveyed the faces before him. These were not just soldiers under his command. They were sons, fathers, brothers, and friends who had placed their trust in his leadership. He saw Private Heinrich Muller, barely 18 years old, whose mother had written to Weber asking him to watch over her boy. He noticed Corporal Stefan Weber, no relation despite the shared surname, who had saved 3 wounded comrades during a retreat the previous winter and earned a medal for his courage. The general's voice carried clearly across the silent courtyard as he began to speak. Instead of immediately delivering the salute order, he chose to address his troops with words that reflected his own struggle with the situation. He spoke of duty and honor, of the sacred trust between commanders and soldiers, and of the principles that had guided the German military through generations of service. Weber explained that they had been ordered to demonstrate their loyalty through a particular salute that represented allegiance to the current political leadership. His words were carefully chosen to convey both the official requirement and his own reservations about its implications. He made it clear that this ceremony was not of his choosing, but was a directive from higher command that could not be ignored without serious consequences. As the general continued his address, an unexpected murmur began to ripple through the ranks. What started as barely audible whispers among the soldiers gradually grew into a more noticeable disturbance. Sergeant Major Brennan, standing at the front of his formation, exchanged glances with other senior non-commissioned officers who seemed to be communicating through subtle gestures and expressions. Weber paused in his remarks, uncertain how to interpret the growing unrest among his troops. Military discipline demanded absolute silence during official ceremonies, and the fact that his soldiers were openly displaying their discomfort indicated the depth of their concerns about what they were being asked to do. Lieutenant Bauer noticed that the soldiers in his platoon were shifting uncomfortably, their usual military bearing replaced by obvious signs of internal conflict. Private Muller, the young man whose mother had entrusted him to Weber's care, appeared to be struggling with tears, his emotions clearly visible despite his efforts to maintain composure. The situation reached a critical point when Corporal Weber, the decorated soldier who had shown such courage in rescuing his wounded comrades, took a step forward from his position in the formation. This breach of military protocol was shocking in itself, but what followed was even more unprecedented. The corporal looked directly at his commanding general and spoke words that would echo through military history. Weber addressed his general with respect, but firmness, stating that he could not in good conscience participate in a ceremony that violated his personal beliefs and the oath he had taken as a soldier. His voice carried across the silent courtyard, reaching every ear and touching every heart present. The corporal explained that his loyalty to his country and his respect for his commanding officer remained unwavering, but that he could not compromise his fundamental principles, even under direct orders. What happened next defied every expectation and challenged every assumption about military discipline and authority. Instead of ordering the corporal's immediate arrest for insubordination, General Weber stood in stunned silence as more soldiers began to step forward. One by one, then in groups, hundreds of his troops moved out of formation to stand beside Corporal Weber in a display of collective conscience that was both inspiring and terrifying in its implications. Sergeant Major Brennan was among the first senior non-commissioned officers to join the growing group of soldiers who had chosen principle over protocol. His decision carried particular weight because of his rank and experience, and it gave permission to others who might have hesitated to take such a dramatic stand. Lieutenant Bauer, despite his youth and inexperience, also stepped forward, his action representing the voice of a new generation of military officers who refused to abandon their moral compass. Private Muller, the young soldier whose mother had placed her trust in Weber's leadership, moved to join his comrades with tears streaming down his face. His emotional response reflected the internal struggle that many of the soldiers were experiencing as they chose between obedience and conscience. The sight of this young man's courage in the face of potential consequences moved even the most hardened veterans in the formation. Captain Mueller watched from beside the platform as nearly 600 of the 800 assembled soldiers abandoned their positions to stand together in an unprecedented act of collective resistance. The remaining soldiers who stayed in formation were not necessarily less principled. Many were simply paralyzed by the magnitude of what was occurring and uncertain about how to respond to such an extraordinary situation. Weber found himself facing a crisis that no military manual had prepared him to handle. His soldiers had essentially staged a peaceful mutiny, but they had done so out of respect for the very principles that he had spent his career teaching them. Their actions reflected the success of his leadership in developing thinking soldiers who understood that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to say no. The general realized that he was witnessing something remarkable and unprecedented in military history. His soldiers were demonstrating that effective leadership creates individuals who are capable of independent moral judgment, even when such judgment conflicts with direct orders. The salute ceremony that was supposed to demonstrate blind obedience had instead revealed the power of conscience and the strength of shared values. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Weber understood that this moment would define not only his own legacy, but also the character of every person present. The unexpected response to his salute order had created a situation that would test everyone's courage, principle, and understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and danger. What would happen next would depend on choices that went far beyond military protocol and touched the very essence of human dignity and moral courage. The general looked out at his soldiers, knowing that whatever decision he made in the next few moments would echo through history and define the true meaning of leadership in the face of impossible circumstances. The tension in the courtyard was suffocating as General Weber faced the most defining moment of his career. 600 soldiers stood before him in an act of collective conscience that challenged everything he had been taught about military command. The remaining 200 soldiers remained frozen in formation, their faces reflecting the same internal struggle that had driven their comrades to take their unprecedented stand. Weber's mind raced through the possible consequences of what was unfolding. Military law was clear about the punishment for mutiny, even peaceful resistance to direct orders. Each soldier who had stepped out of formation faced court-martial, imprisonment, or worse. As their commanding officer, he bore responsibility for their actions and would undoubtedly face his own severe consequences for failing to maintain discipline. But as he looked into the faces of his troops, Weber saw something that transcended military regulations and political directives. He saw the faces of men who had been shaped by his own leadership philosophy, soldiers who had learned to think critically about their duties and to understand that true honor sometimes required difficult choices. In their act of resistance, he recognized the success of everything he had tried to teach them about courage, integrity, and moral responsibility. The general's aide, Captain Mueller, stepped closer to the platform, his own face reflecting the weight of the decision he knew his commander was about to make. Mueller had served with Weber long enough to recognize the signs of his internal struggle, and he understood that whatever happened next would determine not only their immediate fate, but also the kind of men they would be remembered as being. Among the soldiers who had stepped forward, Sergeant Major Brennan maintained his military bearing while clearly demonstrating his commitment to his principles. His presence among the resistors gave legitimacy to their actions and showed that this was not a spontaneous rebellion, but a thoughtful response to orders that violated their fundamental beliefs. Brennan's 20 years of exemplary service carried weight that even the most rigid military tribunal would have to acknowledge. Lieutenant Bauer, despite his youth and inexperience, stood tall among his men, his decision to join their resistance representing the voice of a new generation of officers who refused to compromise their moral compass for the sake of advancement or safety. His courage in taking such a stand so early in his career demonstrated that the principles Weber had tried to instill in his command had taken root even among the youngest members of his unit. Private Muller, the 18-year-old whose mother had entrusted his care to Weber, wiped the tears from his face and stood with quiet dignity among his older, more experienced comrades. His presence reminded everyone present that this moment was about more than military protocol. It was about the kind of future they wanted to create and the values they wanted to pass on to the next generation. Weber slowly folded the official directive that had started this confrontation and placed it in his uniform pocket. The gesture was simple, but it carried profound meaning for everyone watching. By putting away the orders rather than reading them aloud, the general was making a choice that would define his legacy and potentially sacrifice his career for the sake of his principles. The general stepped to the edge of the platform and addressed his soldiers with a voice that carried both authority and humility. He acknowledged their courage in taking such a difficult stand and expressed his pride in their commitment to their convictions. His words were carefully chosen to convey support for their actions while also recognizing the serious nature of the situation they all faced together. Weber explained that he understood their position because he shared their concerns about the order they had been given. He admitted that he had struggled with his own conscience while preparing for this ceremony, and that their collective response had helped him see the path forward. The general's honesty about his own doubts created a moment of connection between commander and troops that transcended the traditional boundaries of military hierarchy. What happened next shocked everyone present, including Weber himself. The general removed his cap and stood at attention facing his soldiers. In a gesture that violated every convention of military protocol, he stepped down from the platform and walked slowly toward the group of resistors. Each step he took was a choice that moved him further from the safety of following orders and closer to sharing the fate of his subordinates. When Weber reached the front of the group, he turned to face the remaining soldiers who had stayed in formation. His voice carried across the courtyard as he addressed them with words that would be remembered long after this day had passed. He explained that leadership meant more than simply following orders. It meant taking responsibility for the consequences of those orders and protecting the men under your command from actions that violated their fundamental humanity. The general made it clear that any soldier who chose to remain in formation would face no criticism or consequences from him. He recognized that each person had to make their own decision based on their individual circumstances and beliefs. Some had families to protect. Others had career aspirations that such an act of resistance would destroy. Weber respected their right to make different choices while also making his own position unmistakably clear. Weber then did something that no one expected. He walked to where Corporal Weber stood and extended his hand in a gesture of respect and solidarity. The corporal, overwhelmed by this unprecedented display of support from his commanding officer, accepted the handshake with tears in his eyes. The sight of a general showing such respect for a subordinate's moral courage created a moment that transcended military rank and touched the hearts of everyone present. As Weber moved through the group of soldiers who had taken their stand, he shook hands with each one, looking them in the eye and expressing his respect for their courage. His actions demonstrated that true leadership meant standing with your troops when they were doing what was right, even when such support came at great personal cost. The ceremony that was supposed to demonstrate obedience to political authority had instead become a powerful testimony to the strength of moral conviction and the bond between soldiers who shared common values. The salute that the soldiers were ordered to give had been replaced by something far more meaningful, a mutual demonstration of respect between leaders and followers who understood that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Captain Mueller, watching from his position near the platform, realized that he was witnessing a moment that would be studied in military academies for generations to come. This was leadership stripped to its essence, demonstrated not through the exercise of authority, but through the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of principle. The sun was now low on the horizon, casting the entire scene in golden light that seemed to highlight the historic nature of what was occurring. The shadows grew longer as the moment stretched out, each second adding weight to decisions that would echo through history and inspire future generations of soldiers who faced similar moral challenges. As Weber finished his circuit through the group of resistors, he returned to stand before all of his assembled troops. The remaining soldiers in formation had watched their commanding officer's actions with a mixture of admiration and concern, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary, but uncertain about what consequences would follow. The general's next words would determine not only the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but also the legacy that would survive long after all the participants had passed into history. Weber understood that this moment required him to find words that would honor the courage of his soldiers, while also preparing them for the difficult period that lay ahead. The decision he was about to announce would cement his place in military history as either a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral flexibility or an inspiration for future leaders who might face similar challenges. As he prepared to speak, Weber knew that there was no path forward that would avoid consequences, but he also knew that some choices were more important than safety or career advancement. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone present understood that what happened next would define not only their individual futures, but also the meaning of honor, courage, and leadership in the face of impossible circumstances. The morning after the unprecedented events in the courtyard brought with it a cold reality that everyone involved had anticipated but hoped might somehow be avoided. General Weber sat in his office as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, knowing that his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom hung in the balance. The reports he was required to submit to headquarters would seal not only his own fate, but also that of every soldier who had participated in the previous day's act of collective resistance. The telegram that arrived at 0600 hours bore the seal of the highest military command and contained language that left no doubt about the seriousness with which Weber's superiors viewed the situation. Field Marshal Heinrich von Steuben, Weber's immediate superior and a man known for his rigid adherence to military protocol, had been ordered to conduct an immediate investigation into what was being termed a serious breach of military discipline and failure of command authority. Weber read the message with the calm acceptance of a soldier who had always known that his career might end in disgrace if he ever chose principle over politics. The field marshal had been a contemporary of Weber's throughout their military careers, and while they had maintained professional respect for each other, von Steuben had always been more willing to adapt to changing political winds. The irony was not lost on Weber that his fate would be determined by someone whose flexibility he had once secretly criticized. Captain Mueller knocked quietly on the door before entering with additional correspondence that had arrived during the night. Among the official communications were personal letters that revealed the broader impact of the previous day's events. Word of what had occurred had spread beyond the confines of the military base, creating ripples that reached into the highest levels of government and the deepest corners of civil society. The captain's own future was equally uncertain, as his loyalty to Weber and his presence during the ceremony made him complicit in what was being characterized as a failure to maintain discipline. Mueller had spent much of the night considering his options, but he remained committed to standing by his commanding officer regardless of the consequences. His decision reflected the same moral courage that had driven the soldiers to take their stand. Among the soldiers who had participated in the resistance, the mood was somber but resolute. Sergeant Major Brennan had spent the early morning hours talking with the younger soldiers, helping them understand what they could expect in the coming days and ensuring that they remained committed to the choice they had made. His experience and steady presence provided crucial stability during a time when fear and uncertainty might have otherwise led to regret and recrimination. Lieutenant Bauer, despite his youth, had emerged as a natural leader among the resistors. His decision to sacrifice his promising career for the sake of his principles had inspired even the most experienced soldiers and demonstrated that moral courage was not dependent on age or experience. The young officer had written letters to his family explaining his actions and preparing them for the possibility that he might face imprisonment or worse. Private Muller, the 18-year-old whose emotional response had moved everyone present, had spent the night writing to his mother. His letter attempted to explain why he had chosen to follow his conscience, even though it meant disappointing her hopes for his military career. The young soldier's words reflected a maturity that had been forged in the crucible of moral decision-making and would serve him well regardless of what consequences he faced. The investigation that followed was thorough and relentless. Field Marshal von Steuben arrived with a team of military prosecutors and investigators who interviewed every soldier present during the ceremony. Their questions were designed to establish not only the facts of what had occurred, but also the extent to which Weber had encouraged or permitted the resistance to his orders. The interrogation sessions revealed the complexity of the situation and the careful thought that had gone into each individual's decision. The investigators discovered that there had been no coordination or planning among the soldiers. Their collective action had emerged spontaneously from shared values and mutual respect rather than organized rebellion. This finding actually made the situation more concerning to military authorities, as it suggested that the resistance represented a fundamental rejection of the new political order rather than a temporary breakdown in discipline. Weber's own testimony was measured and honest. He refused to blame his subordinates for their actions or to claim that he had been coerced into supporting them. Instead, he took full responsibility for creating an environment where soldiers felt empowered to act on their convictions, and acknowledged that his own leadership philosophy had contributed to their willingness to resist orders they found morally objectionable. The general's words during his interrogation became a testament to his character and beliefs. He explained that he had always taught his soldiers to think critically about their duties and to understand that blind obedience was not the highest virtue in military service. Weber argued that soldiers who were capable of moral reasoning were more effective in combat and more trustworthy in positions of responsibility. When pressed about his failure to arrest the soldiers who had stepped out of formation, Weber responded with words that would be quoted in military academies for decades to come. He stated that true leadership required the courage to stand with your subordinates when they were doing what was right, even when such support violated regulations or endangered your own position. His refusal to abandon his principles, even under intense pressure, demonstrated the strength of character that had earned him the loyalty of his troops. The investigation also revealed the broader implications of the incident for military morale and discipline. Reports from other commands indicated that word of Weber's support for his soldiers' moral stand had spread throughout the army, inspiring some officers while alarming others. The incident had become a symbol of the tension between military tradition and political expediency that was affecting the entire German military establishment. Field Marshal von Steuben found himself in an impossible position as he prepared his report. While military law clearly required severe punishment for the actions of Weber and his soldiers, von Steuben also recognized that such punishment might create martyrs and further inflame resistance to the new political order. The field marshal's own reputation and career prospects depended on finding a way to resolve the situation that satisfied his superiors while minimizing the broader damage to military cohesion. The proceedings revealed character and courage in unexpected places. Several officers who had not been present during the original incident came forward to testify on behalf of Weber and his soldiers. Colonel Ernst Hoffmann, Weber's chief of staff, provided powerful testimony about his commander's integrity and the positive impact of his leadership on unit morale and effectiveness. Major Wilhelm Schultz spoke eloquently about the moral dilemma that all soldiers faced when orders conflicted with their fundamental beliefs. His words helped the investigators understand that the resistance was not an act of rebellion against military authority, but rather an expression of the values that made effective soldiers in the first place. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Richter's testimony focused on the training and discipline that had characterized Weber's command. He argued that the general's emphasis on developing thinking soldiers rather than mindless followers had actually enhanced rather than diminished the unit's military effectiveness. Richter's evidence challenged the assumption that moral reasoning was incompatible with military discipline. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the consequences would extend far beyond the immediate participants. The incident had exposed fundamental questions about the role of conscience in military service and the limits of obedience that could not be easily resolved through traditional disciplinary measures. The soldiers who had remained in formation during the original ceremony also faced scrutiny and pressure. Some were criticized by their families and communities for failing to stand up for their beliefs, while others were praised for maintaining military discipline in difficult circumstances. The investigation revealed that their decisions had been no less difficult than those made by the soldiers who had stepped forward. Weber's family received both support and criticism from their community. His wife, Maria, had always been proud of her husband's military career and struggled to understand how his commitment to principle might destroy everything they had worked to build. Their son Klaus, serving as a lieutenant in another division, found himself defending his father's actions to fellow officers who viewed the incident as a dangerous precedent. As the investigation neared its conclusion, it became clear that the consequences would be severe and far-reaching. The precedent set by Weber's actions and his soldiers' response had implications that extended well beyond military discipline and touched on fundamental questions about the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority. The final phase of the investigation focused on determining appropriate punishment and developing policies to prevent similar incidents in the future. The recommendations that emerged would shape military conduct for years to come and influence how future generations of soldiers understood their duties and responsibilities. The final verdict came down 6 weeks after that fateful afternoon in the courtyard, delivered in a stark military tribunal room where the weight of history seemed to press down on everyone present. General Heinrich Weber stood at attention as Field Marshal von Steuben read the decision that would determine not only his fate, but also set a precedent that would echo through military history for generations to come. Weber's court-martial had become a focal point for debates about military duty, moral courage, and the limits of obedience that extended far beyond the confines of the German military establishment. International observers, military historians, and philosophers had followed the proceedings with intense interest, recognizing that the outcome would influence how armed forces around the world understood the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority. The verdict itself was unprecedented in its complexity. Weber was found guilty of failure to maintain military discipline and disobedience of direct orders, charges that carried severe penalties including dismissal from service, loss of pension, and possible imprisonment. However, the tribunal also issued findings that acknowledged the moral courage demonstrated by Weber and his soldiers, noting that their actions, while technically violations of military law, had been motivated by principles that represented the highest traditions of military honor. Field Marshal von Steuben's reading of the verdict revealed the internal struggle that had characterized the entire investigation. The tribunal had been forced to balance the need for military discipline against recognition that blind obedience was not always the highest virtue in military service. Their decision attempted to punish the technical violations while honoring the moral courage that had motivated them. Weber accepted his punishment with the same dignity that had characterized his entire military career. His dismissal from service was effective immediately, and his pension was forfeited as a consequence of his court-martial conviction. However, the general's response to these penalties demonstrated the strength of character that had earned him the loyalty of his troops and the respect of his peers. The fate of the soldiers who had participated in the resistance was equally complex. The 600 men who had stepped out of formation faced disciplinary action ranging from reprimands to reduction in rank, but none were imprisoned or dismissed from service. The tribunal recognized that their actions had been influenced by Weber's leadership and that prosecuting them more severely might undermine military morale and effectiveness. Sergeant Major Brennan received a formal reprimand but retained his rank and position, a decision that reflected the tribunal's recognition of his 20 years of exemplary service and the positive influence he had exercised during the crisis. His continued presence in the military provided stability and continuity that helped other soldiers understand that moral courage was compatible with military service. Lieutenant Bauer's punishment was more severe, reflecting the higher standards expected of commissioned officers. He was reduced in rank to second lieutenant and transferred to another unit, but his military career was not destroyed. The young officer's willingness to sacrifice his advancement for his principles had impressed even his critics and ensured that he would be remembered as an example of moral courage for future generations of military leaders. Private Muller, the youngest participant in the resistance, received the lightest punishment of all. The tribunal recognized that his actions had been influenced by the leadership and example of older, more experienced soldiers. His letter to his mother explaining his decision had been entered into evidence and had moved even the most hardened military prosecutors with its sincerity and maturity. Captain Mueller, Weber's aide and loyal supporter, was transferred to another command but retained his rank and suffered no permanent damage to his career. His unwavering loyalty to his commanding officer had been noted by the tribunal as evidence of Weber's positive influence on his subordinates, even when that influence had led to technically illegal actions. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond the immediate participants. Military academies around the world incorporated the incident into their curricula as a case study in moral leadership and the limits of obedience. The questions raised by Weber's actions and his soldiers' response became standard elements in discussions of military ethics and professional responsibility. Weber's post-military life demonstrated the same principles that had defined his military career. Despite losing his pension and facing financial hardship, he refused offers of support from sympathizers who wanted to make him a symbol of resistance to political authority. Instead, he found work as a teacher in a small Bavarian village, where he influenced young minds with the same emphasis on critical thinking and moral reasoning that had characterized his military leadership. The general's teaching career became an extension of his military service, as he helped young people understand the importance of moral courage and the responsibility that came with positions of authority. His classroom became a laboratory for the same leadership philosophy that had inspired his soldiers to take their unprecedented stand. Maria Weber, the general's wife, initially struggled with the loss of status and financial security that accompanied her husband's dismissal from military service. However, she eventually came to understand that his actions had preserved something more valuable than career advancement or material comfort. Her support during the difficult transition demonstrated the same moral courage that had characterized her husband's decision. Klaus Weber, the general's son, found that his father's example influenced his own military career in unexpected ways. Initially concerned about the impact on his advancement prospects, the young lieutenant gradually realized that the principles his father had demonstrated provided better guidance for military leadership than any regulation or political directive. His subsequent career became a testament to the enduring value of moral courage in military service. The investigation and trial had also revealed the character of other participants in ways that surprised even close observers. Field Marshal von Steuben, despite his role in prosecuting Weber, privately expressed admiration for the general's courage and integrity. His own report to higher command included recommendations for policy changes that would provide better guidance for future situations where orders conflicted with moral convictions. Colonel Hoffman, Weber's former chief of staff, was promoted to command the unit in the wake of the general's dismissal. His first act was to institute training programs that emphasized the importance of moral reasoning in military decision-making, ensuring that Weber's leadership philosophy would continue to influence the unit even in his absence. The long-term impact of the incident extended into the post-war period, when many of the soldiers who had participated in the resistance found themselves in positions of leadership in the rebuilt German military. Their experience had taught them that true military professionalism required the ability to distinguish between legitimate orders and directives that violated fundamental human dignity. Sergeant Major Brennan eventually rose to officer rank and became known for his emphasis on developing thinking soldiers who understood their moral obligations as well as their tactical duties. His career became a bridge between the old military traditions and the new emphasis on ethical conduct that characterized post-war military service. Lieutenant Bauer, despite his initial setback, eventually achieved flag rank and became known as one of the most principled officers of his generation. His early demonstration of moral courage had marked him as a leader who could be trusted in difficult situations, and his subsequent career validated that assessment. Private Muller completed his military service with distinction and went on to become a successful businessman whose companies were known for their ethical practices and commitment to employee welfare. His experience as an 18-year-old soldier who had chosen principle over safety influenced his approach to leadership throughout his life. The incident also inspired similar acts of moral courage in other military establishments around the world. Officers and soldiers facing their own ethical dilemmas found guidance in Weber's example and the response of his troops. The case became a reference point for discussions of military ethics in democratic societies struggling to define the proper role of armed forces. Decades later, military historians recognized that Weber's salute order had marked a turning point in understanding the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority. The general's willingness to support his soldiers' moral stand, even at great personal cost, had demonstrated that true leadership required more than technical competence or political adaptability. The courtyard where the original incident occurred eventually became a memorial site, not as a monument to rebellion against authority, but as a testament to the moral courage that made effective military service possible. The inscription placed there years later read simply, "Here stood soldiers who understood that duty means more than obedience." Weber himself lived long enough to see his actions vindicated by history and his principles incorporated into military doctrine around the world. His final years were marked by correspondence with military leaders, historians, and philosophers who sought to understand how one man's decision to support his soldier's conscience had influenced military culture for generations. The general's death was mourned not only by those who had served under him, but by military professionals around the world who recognized that his example had made their own service more meaningful and morally grounded. His funeral was attended by hundreds of former soldiers who credited his leadership with helping them understand the true meaning of military honor. The legacy of that afternoon in the Bavarian courtyard continued to influence military education and leadership development long after all the original participants had passed away. The questions raised by Weber's salute order and his soldiers' response remained relevant wherever military professionals faced the challenge of balancing obedience with conscience. The story of General Heinrich Weber and his soldiers' unprecedented stand became more than just a historical curiosity. It became a foundational narrative about the nature of moral leadership and the courage required to do what is right when the whole world seems to demand compromise. Their example demonstrated that true military excellence required not just technical skill and physical courage, but also the moral strength to stand up for principles even when such stands came at great personal cost. In the end, the salute order that was supposed to demonstrate blind obedience had instead revealed the power of conscience and the enduring strength of moral conviction. The result that no one could have believed had become a testament to the human capacity for courage in the face of impossible choices, and a reminder that leadership means more than simply following orders.